Hey guys, tonight we descend into the velvet-draped corridors of Versailles, not the Versailles in your textbook, with powdered wigs and formal bows, but the one that smells faintly of rose water, candle wax, and secrets. You're not a tourist here. You're slipping past the gilded doors with the rest of the courtiers, moving silently beneath the chandeliers, just close enough to hear the whispered names of kings and the women who bent them like silk ribbons. Tonight's story isn't about battles or treaties. It's about power traded not in swords, but glances. About women who entered the palace as nobodies and left a mark that echoed through centuries. It's about perfumes laced with arsenic, beds that doubled as confessionals, and a world where one raised eyebrow could seal your fate. Versailles was no place for the faint of heart. Honestly, you probably won't survive this place without a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of self-preservation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who else is listening in the candlelight tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the gravel path of the palace gardens, moonlight scattered across the trimmed hedges like spilled sugar. Versailles isn't quiet, not really. There's always the rustle of silk somewhere, the shuffle of guards, the breathless hush of servants who know too much. But to the untrained eye, everything gleams. You've arrived in the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. And like the sun, he expects the world to revolve around him. You pass a row of nobles frozen in their own pageantry, each more embroidered than the last. The men puffed up with medals, the women dripping in pearls too heavy for their necks. But it's not the official wives who hold the real power. Oh no! That honor belongs to the mistresses. Or as they're politely titled, les maîtresses en titre. In this game of lace and shadows, the official queen is often a background character, while the mistress lives in the king's ear, his bed, and, occasionally, his war council. This isn't just about lust. It's about proximity to power. A mistress could change laws, appoint ministers, or bankrupt entire regions with a single suggestion made over breakfast. Historians still argue whether France's colonial policy in the 18th century was influenced by a single comment from a woman wrapped in lilac sheets. You pause beside a fresco, gold leaf curling at the edges, and imagine the scene behind it. A secret door perhaps, a staircase, maybe even a spy hole. Versailles was built to dazzle, but also to deceive. Everything had a hidden layer. Even the flowers in the gardens were chosen not for their beauty, but for their symbolism. Orange blossoms for fidelity, violets for modesty, and roses for passion or revenge. Now you slip into the hall of mirrors. The room flickers with candlelight multiplied 100-fold. You see yourself from every angle, but also every lie told here over the past century. Treaties signed with insincere smiles. Affairs begun with the flick of a fan. Duels settled with coded glances. This hall isn't just a symbol of royal might, it's a circus mirror reflecting all the ways people pretended. You lean against the cool marble and feel it hum with centuries of stories. Do you hear it? The footsteps of Louise de la Valliere, the quiet one, the reluctant mistress who tried to escape more than once? Or Athénais de Montespan, whose perfume still lingers like smoke from a fire long extinguished? You will meet them soon enough. But first, understand this, Versailles was a theater. The kind where no one ever clapped, but everyone performed. And the starring roles didn't always go to the noble, or even the legal. They went to the captivating, the daring, the ones who wore their ambition like a silk corset, tight enough to reshape their entire lives. And as you linger in the corner of a grand salon, a harpsichord tinkling somewhere in the distance, you realize you're not watching a history. You're stepping into a maze of seduction, politics, and velvet-covered secrets. One slipper at a time. You spot her before the others whisper her name. A little behind the formal procession, eyes downcast, hair the shade of late harvest wheat and parted modestly, Louise de la Valliere doesn't sparkle like the others. No diamonds. No dangerous smiles. Just a quiet kind of gentleness that makes you think she was meant to be somewhere simpler. But Versailles doesn't care for simplicity. It devours it. Louise begins as a lady-in-waiting to Louis XIV's sister-in-law, barely more than background noise in the gilded machinery of court. She walks with a slight limp, a detail most would hide in shame, but she wears it like an afterthought. And maybe that's what first draws the king. Not the flash of cleavage or the sway of hips, but the one woman in the room who isn't trying to be noticed. You follow her through the palace, watching how the servants' eyes change. At first, they look through her. Then they begin to linger. Then they lower their gaze altogether. Something has shifted. Louis, the Sun King, has glanced in her direction, and that's all it takes. A glance from him is like sunlight hitting dry kindling. There's a quiet sort of dread in her love story. Not the romantic kind with violins and swoons, but the creeping sense of drowning while everyone claps. At first, Louis woos her gently. Poems, actual poems, not dictated ones, private carriage rides, long walks in the gardens where real conversations happen. Not about battles or dresses, but about books, about music, about meaning. And you think, maybe she's different. Maybe this won't end like the others. But Versailles is not kind of feelings. Soon, Louise is installed in rooms closer to the king. Her name floats through corridors. The queen, Marie-Therese, retreats behind her rosary beads. And Louis? He continues his play as God of France, with Louise as his favored mortal. They have children, 4 of them. But only 2 survive. Even in luxury, death is a frequent guest. Here's a fact. One of their children, Louis de Bourbon, would later become a legitimate duke, folded into the nobility like a creased letter. The boy's title didn't erase his origin, but in Versailles, legitimacy was often a suggestion, not a rule. Still, Louise isn't made for this game. The titles don't console her. The jewels feel like bribes. The court's sarcasm cuts deeper than swords. And then, Athenais arrives. The woman who smells like jasmine and speaks like poetry dipped in venom. Louise fades to the background, like ink left too long in the sun. And here's the thing, she stays. For a while. Longer than she should have. She watches her rival rise, watches the king drift, and still holds her tongue. Historians still argue whether Louise loved Louis or was simply too broken to leave. Some say she clung to the past, others whisper she hoped for redemption. One day, she vanishes from a royal ball. No drama. No note. Just gone. You trace her steps to the Carmelite convent at Rue Saint-Jacques. The air smells of wax and humility. She shaves her head. Takes a new name. Lives the rest of her life in penance and silence. But the irony? Even in the convent, she's still a subject of court gossip. Her letters get intercepted. Her visitors are monitored. It seems you can't escape Versailles, not even with God as your roommate. And yet, maybe she did escape. Maybe giving it all up was the only way to win. A small aside for you, court records once described her voice as melancholy honey. Imagine that. A woman whose heartbreak had a flavor. You step out of her memory slowly, back into the perfumed corridors of Versailles. The echoes of her soft footsteps replaced by the sharper clack of Athenais' heels. The next chapter? It won't be so quiet. You hear her before you see her. Not her voice, no. Athenais de Montespan's Réal entrance is olfactory. She smells like scandal dipped in orange blossom. It clings to the air like heat after a thunderstorm. You turn your head, and there she is, curves unapologetically outlined, eyes sharp as tailor's shears, a laugh that somehow sounds both cruel and musical. You don't meet Athenais. You survive her. Born Françoise Athenais de Roquecourt de Mortemart, yes, all of that. She arrives at court already fluent in aristocratic sarcasm and the art of timing a compliment like a dagger to the ribs. She's married, technically, but her husband is little more than a placeholder. Her real ambition? Louis XIV. And she doesn't just want to be his mistress. She wants to be his partner, his equal, his addiction. You watch the transition happen in real time. Louise is still there, clinging to shadows, but Athenais enters the court like she owns it. And somehow, she does. She knows exactly when to look impressed, when to yawn, when to let her wrist go limp so the diamonds slide just so down her arm. She reads Louis perfectly, flatters his mind, not just his ego. She can talk politics, art, theology, even naval ship design if it means holding his attention for 2 more minutes. Soon enough, her rooms are upgraded, her servants multiplied, and her husband? Shipped off, disgraced, and furious. He leaves court in a carriage painted black in protest, the word cuckold practically scrawled across the wheels. Now Athenais is the maitresse en titre, and Versailles bends to her the way sunflowers chase light. But not all stories rise in straight lines. You start to hear whispers, first in the servants' quarters, then in the confessional. There's talk of Lavoisin, a poisoner and midwife who holds black masses in candlelit cellars. There are rumors of powdered potions mixed into chocolates, of priests performing forbidden rites, laying naked on altars, of Athenais paying handsomely for their services. Historians still argue whether she actually took part. Some say her enemies forged evidence that it was a smear campaign fueled by jealousy. Others point to the sheer volume of testimonies, servants, lovers, priests, all describing the same rituals, the same silver chalices, the same infants allegedly sacrificed in exchange for royal favor. One particularly eerie detail, a court alchemist once recorded that Athenais wore a charm around her neck, supposedly soaked in the blood of a bat, a dove, and a virgin. True? Maybe not. But the story stuck. Versailles runs on whispers, not proof. You peek into the affair of the poisons, the scandal that explodes in the late 1670s. Dozens are arrested, tortured, executed. Some confess things that sound like nightmares stitched together by gossipmongers. A noblewoman claims she fed her rival a cake laced with arsenic, twice. Another says she paid for a love spell involving the bones of a hanged man. Athenais is never officially charged. But suddenly, she's quieter. Her influence dims. Louis grows colder. Her name is omitted from events where once she shined. And in a court that thrives on attention, fading is worse than death. Here's a curious fact. Years later, Athenais is buried in a plain tomb, her name carved modestly. No grandeur. No tribute. Just a sigh in marble. But don't be fooled. Her legacy survives in the language of power. Every seductress who mixes wit with strategy, every woman who walks into a room and rearranges its politics with a glance, that's Athenais. You carry her in the air of ambition, in the perfume that hides 100 secrets. As you move deeper into the palace, the candles seem to flicker lower. The corridors less welcoming. There's a lesson Athenais never learned, but you must. In Versailles, being adored is dangerous. But being feared? That's how you survive. You follow the ripple of gossip through the marble corridors like a bloodhound on silk carpets. It's not just the king's affection that moves fast here, it's the stories people spin about it. Versailles, despite its gold leaf and fluted columns, is really just one gigantic whisper network held together by powdered wigs and mutual blackmail. You pause near a rosewood writing desk. It's not the antique elegance that draws you in, it's the note left beneath the inkwell. 3 lines. Barely legible. A name, a time, and the phrase Le Rideau Gris. The gray curtain. A rendezvous? A signal? In this place, everything can mean something else. You shift your attention to the bedchambers. Not the queen's, of course, that space was more ceremonial than marital. No, the real action happens behind a different set of doors, the ones where courtiers sneak in, pages linger a beat too long, and the maids whisper about what they accidentally saw. Silken sheets in Versailles were rarely just for sleep. You run your fingers along one and wonder how many conversations unfolded here, some tender, others transactional, and a few so politically loaded they might as well have come with a treaty attached. Louis XIV didn't just lie with women, he made declarations between the pillows. Sometimes about troop movements. Sometimes about tax reforms. Once, he reportedly gave an order for a new opera commission mid-embrace. Priorities. But this isn't just about the king. You listen in on the ladies-in-waiting, a ferocious group armed with fans, secrets, and the emotional stamina of gladiators. They know which nobleman snuck into the wrong room last night. They know the duchess who's secretly receiving love letters from a Jesuit. They even know that the royal apothecary has been asked for more nightshade than usual, never a good sign. Here's a historical footnote you didn't expect. One documented court scandal involved a diamond necklace, a forged letter from Marie Antoinette, long before her own reign, and an ambitious countess pretending to be a royal go-between. The fallout? Public trials. Nobles exiled. And a very awkward dinner party. But back to your present scene. A woman named Madame de Litters has caught Louis's wandering eye. She's clever, charming, and, crucially, unaware that Athenais isn't done fighting. The two women don't duel in the open. That would be gauche. No, they exchange veiled insults at salons, give each other overly polite curtsies with razor-thin smiles, and send anonymous verses to pamphleteers in Paris to start spontaneous rumors. The scandal doesn't stay between the sheets for long. Courtiers take sides. Poets write biting rhymes. Even servants weigh in, trading stories in the kitchens as though they're refereeing a boxing match with lace gloves. Here's where it gets juicy. One night, a letter intended for Louis ends up in the wrong hands. It contains not only love declarations, but a brief aside mentioning a bishop, a gambling debt, and a small chest of herbal tinctures that sound suspiciously unliturgical. Historians still argue who wrote the letter. Some blame Lutters herself. Others suspect a frame job by Athenais Camp. But the outcome is the same. Lutters is suddenly persona non grata. Her dresses go unworn. Her invitations stop coming. She leaves court for health reasons, which is court speak for politically annihilated. Meanwhile, Athenais remains in place, though her crown slips slightly with each passing scandal. The king grows wary. Not distant, but careful. You sense it in the way he nods now, more perfunctory. Less enchanted. Versailles never forgets a fall. You walk past a mirror and catch your reflection. It's strange, being surrounded by so much artifice and realizing how much truth lies in what isn't said. In Versailles, silence is a blade just as sharp as any insult. Tonight, beneath the sheets, behind the curtains, and inside the coded phrases etched into parchment, you've seen how love at court is never just about hearts. It's about leverage. And survival. You move through the corridors slower now, as if the walls themselves are listening. The palace has changed, not in structure, but in mood. Something has shifted. The scandals still swirl, but they feel heavier. Less playful. And at the center of this new gravity is a woman cloaked in modesty, gloved in restraint, and crowned in quiet ambition, Madame de Maintenon. She doesn't burst into court like Athenais did, all glitter and perfume. No. She slides in through the edges, like a shadow that nobody noticed until it started blocking out the sun. Françoise d'Albine, later known as Madame de Maintenon, is not of noble birth. Her grandfather was a poet. Her father, a criminal. Her early life is more Dickensian than dynastic. She marries a crippled, much older writer, and becomes a widow with barely enough coin to keep a fire lit. But, and you can almost hear Versailles holding its breath, she is smart. Smarter than anyone expects. She begins as a governess to the children of Athenais and Louis XIV, a role few envy. But she doesn't just read bedtime stories and wipe noses. She listens. She observes. She becomes indispensable. You see it in the way Louis speaks to her, not with the flirtatious charm he used on others, but with a kind of unguarded seriousness. She doesn't flatter. She counsels. And over time, the relationship bends and reshapes until, one day, she's not just the governess. She's the confidant, the advisor, the spiritual compass. And then, quietly, shockingly, they marry. Not publicly. That would be scandalous. She's not royal, and certainly not queen material. But privately, in 1683, under the blessings of a bishop and candlelight, Louis XIV weds Madame de Maintenon in what historians still call a morganatic marriage, legally binding, but not granting her any royal title. No crown. No pomp. Just influence. And oh, does she use it? Suddenly, Versailles begins to shift. The body plays vanish from the royal calendar. The mistresses are dismissed or quietly silenced. The king's wardrobe darkens. The salons feel more like seminaries. Madame de Maintenon doesn't declare war on decadence, she outlasts it. With her calm voice and preference for prayer over pageantry, she gradually redefines what power looks like in the Sun King's waning years. Here's a curious tidbit. She founded a school for impoverished noble girls called Saint Cyr, a place where discipline was prized over beauty, and poetry replaced powder. It was both a legacy project and a statement. A mistress who became an educator. A woman of scandal who preached virtue. But the court isn't entirely charmed. Some see her as a manipulative Puritan. Others as a saintly influence. Historians still argue whether she saved Louis's soul or simply suffocated his spirit. Was she the redemption arc, or the final curtain? You spot her one afternoon in the palace chapel. She doesn't sit at the front, but you still feel the room shifting around her. Her expression is unreadable. It always is. But the eyes, they carry the weight of 1,000 secrets, 1,000 prayers, and at least one unspoken regret. One rumor, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, says that on his deathbed, Louis called for her hand, not out of passion, but to ask forgiveness. For the things he'd done in her name. She outlives him. Survives the court she helped purify. Dies quietly, without scandal, without drama. Just as she would have wanted. As you exit the chapel, the air feels thinner. As if something immense has ended, but left behind its shape in the silence. The age of perfumed seductions and public mistresses isn't over yet, but it's been fundamentally altered. Versailles, like the king himself, is aging. And you, dear listener, are walking straight into the twilight of the Sun King's court. The lights are dimmer now, but the shadows? Longer than ever. The candlelight flickers more violently now, not from wind, but from unrest. Versailles still gleams, but there's something brittle in its opulence, like lacquer cracking under its own weight. Louis XIV is gone, entombed in marble and myth. His successor, Louis XV, inherits the throne, the palace, and, inevitably, the machinery of seduction that powered so much of French court politics. And here she comes, Madame du Barry. If Madame de Maintenon was a whisper, du Barry is a cackle. Born Jean Bcu, the illegitimate daughter of a cook and a seamstress, she has no noble blood, no fine schooling, no ancestral tapestries to lean on. What she has is laughter. Blonde hair so bright it seems to have a spotlight. And an instinctive, merciless understanding of male weakness. You first glimpse her at the Foire Saint Laurent, dressed not in silk but in color. Vibrancy in a sea of beige. She works as a courtesan, though not the crass kind. More like a performance artist with better makeup. Her rise is meteoric and carefully arranged. A well-connected count grooms her, invents a noble lineage for her, and, poof, she's married into minor aristocracy just in time for the king to take interest. Louis XV is aging, bored, and spiritually adrift. He's already outlived a wife and a long string of less memorable mistresses. Then Jean appears, and everything glows again. He laughs. He dances. He commissions her pearls the size of plums. She becomes the maîtresse entire before anyone can blink. And Versailles recoils. The nobles sneer, she's lowborn, vulgar, that woman. But Louis doesn't care. He builds her a suite above his own. She dines with him nightly. She receives ambassadors, influences favors, even alters cabinet decisions. When she likes a painter, he becomes the court favorite. When she favors a dressmaker, whole fashions shift. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Madame du Barry loved the smell of heliotrope so much that she had her maids rub the blossoms between their palms before dressing her, sending every room she entered like a living garden. But behind the perfume, the silks, and the diamonds, danger looms. Unlike Athenais, du Barry doesn't weave webs, she sways on a tightrope. She doesn't speak in veiled suggestions, she blurts out opinions. And court hates her for it. Even Marie Antoinette, the Austrian archduchess newly married into the royal family, famously refuses to speak to her, snubbing her at court with teenage frostbite. Du Barry tries to play politics, but it's not her realm. She underestimates how quickly affection curdles into resentment when it rises without permission. The nobles don't forget her origins. She's never truly of Versailles, just allowed to borrow it for a while. Historians still debate whether du Barry genuinely loved the king or simply loved what he gave her. Some letters suggest tenderness. Others, more calculated. One even contains the phrase "better pearls than prayers," possibly penned by her or forged to discredit her. Versailles has never needed truth to keep a scandal burning. And then, the tide shifts. Louis XV dies in 1774, sickened with smallpox, abandoned by most of the court, but not by her. Du Barry stays by his bedside, against all protocol, risking her own life. When he's gone, so is her power. She's exiled. Her jewels confiscated. Her titles stripped like old wallpaper. For a brief moment, she tries to carve out a quieter life in Louveciennes. Hosts small salons. Tends to her roses. Even commissions some delightful porcelain. But history isn't done with her yet. The French Revolution erupts like a kettle left too long on the fire. Her past returns, not as a ghost, but as a warrant. A former mistress to a hated king? That's enough to be guilty. Never mind that she gave away much of her fortune. Never mind that she tried to cooperate. The mobs don't care. You walk beside her as she's dragged to the guillotine. Not in silks this time, just a simple white gown. She pleads. Weeps. Unlike Marie Antoinette, she doesn't go quietly. Her final words are a scream, encore un moment, Monsieur le Bourreau. One more moment, Mr. Executioner. The blade drops. And Versailles, somewhere in the distance, pretends not to hear. You find yourself wandering through a quieter, darker wing of Versailles now, one the tour guides skip. It smells faintly of wax and lavender, though neither scent quite covers the cold. This is where the walls don't echo with laughter but secrets, grim, whispered ones. And if you press your ear close enough, you'll hear it, giggling. Girls giggling. But not the innocent kind. Welcome to the Parc aux Cerfs, the King's private pleasure preserve. A name that sounds almost pastoral. Idyllic. You'd imagine deer grazing and lovers strolling under moonlight. But Parc aux Cerfs doesn't refer to animals. It refers to young girls. Very young girls. And the gates were opened not by nature, but by Louis XV. This section of the palace functioned as something between a harem and a secret apartment complex. At its peak, it housed anywhere from 1 to 5 girls at a time, most between the ages of 12 and 18. They were not courtesans in the traditional sense. These were middle-class daughters, chosen for their looks, trained in etiquette, washed, perfumed, and presented. Like pastries. Or sacrifices. You sit quietly in a faded salon, run your hand along the edge of a vanity still carved with lilies. A girl once cried here, softly, so as not to ruin her makeup. She had been promised an audience with the king, told she would be clothed in silk, fed sweetmeats, given jewels. No one told her what came next. To understand the mechanics of the Parc aux Cerfs, you must understand La Belle, the king's personal valet and, effectively, the recruiter. La Belle received anonymous suggestions from trusted courtiers or scouted candidates himself. He then oversaw their grooming, literally and socially. Bathing rituals. Conversation training. Lessons in dance, posture, restraint. And once they were ready, he presented them, sometimes behind a curtain, sometimes as a surprise guest at a private dinner. One quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit, each girl had a stage name, often a flower. Rose, Violet, Jasmine. This made them interchangeable, forgettable, convenient. Now, you might think the mistresses we've met, Louise, Athénise, Du Barry, were scandalous. But this was different. This wasn't power play seduction. This was a system. A state-funded carousel of intimacy veiled in luxury and operated with the same cold precision as a post office. Historians still argue over how much Louis XV knew, how directly he oversaw this operation. Some say he was barely involved, that La Belle ran it independently to satisfy a lonely monarch. Others believe the king orchestrated every detail and simply insulated himself from guilt through layers of protocol and perfume. But it gets darker. Some of these girls became pregnant. And when that happened, they vanished. Quietly. The children, if born, were sent away. Raised under assumed names, sometimes adopted into minor nobility, other times disappearing altogether. One such child, Agnes Louise de Montreuil, was reportedly fathered by the king and later forced into a convent when her lineage became politically inconvenient. You sit with that for a moment. The idea that behind the velvet, the brocade, and the manicured hedges, this machine was churning, taking an innocence, churning out silence. And yet, Versailles didn't blink. It kept hosting balls. Ministers walked the halls. The court continued its theatrical orbit around a king who, by the 1760s, had become a ghost of himself, withdrawn, paranoid, and oddly devoted to the very system that drained him. There's a disturbing irony here. While the French people starved, their king spent royal funds to keep this covert pleasure house running, albeit discreetly. And one might argue this was the beginning of the end. The fracture. The point where the people stopped seeing their monarch as divine, and started seeing him as diseased. The Parc aux Cerfs was eventually shut down, not by moral outrage, but by fatigue. The king grew older, slower. His heart stopped chasing. And Versailles, well, it didn't mourn. It just turned its head and whispered something else. You leave the room slowly. It's not the grandeur of Versailles that haunts you now. It's the quiet rooms. The ones with names forgotten. The ones whose mirrors were never gilded. By now, you know better than to trust the smiles. The ones plastered across powdered faces, the polite applause at soirees, the cooing at royal portraits. Versailles is a masquerade where even the masks were masks. But if there's one truth everyone here understands, it's this. The king may reign, but his mistress rules. You step into a drawing room bathed in pink satin. There are no guards at the door, no official insignias, but this chamber hums with more influence than the war council. This is where real politics happens, on settees, between cups of chocolate, through veiled compliments that decide the fate of provinces. Tonight, Madame de Pompadour holds court. She's not just a mistress. She's a phenomenon. Jean Antoinette Poisson, yes, her last name means fish, was born into the bourgeoisie, not nobility. But she climbs fast, not through brute ambition, but with an understanding so surgical it feels psychic. She doesn't seduce the king with cleavage. She seduces his boredom. Louis XV is weary, greeting his wife, mourning his youth, and then Pompadour appears, reciting Voltaire, organizing amateur theater performances, discussing global trade routes over breakfast like it's casual gossip. The man is entranced. Here's a quirky fact. She once staged an entire opera in which she played both lead roles, male and female. The court clapped, of course. You don't not clap for Pompadour. But she knows this isn't about entertainment. It's about leverage. Once installed as the maitresse en titre, she doesn't just enjoy influence, she institutionalizes it. She manages ministers, corresponds with philosophers, commissions the École Militaire, supports Enlightenment thinkers, and introduces porcelain from Sèvres into French obsession. Even after the romantic aspect of her relationship with Louis fades, she remains. That alone is revolutionary. She becomes a kind of prime minister in petticoats. She's not sleeping with the king anymore, but she still shares his ear, and that, at Versailles, is more intimate than the bed. But being powerful doesn't mean being untouchable. Other mistresses are whispering. Lesser nobles seethe. Pamphleteers publish obscene cartoons showing her as a puppet master, or worse, a prostitute who climbed into France's throne room one stocking at a time. Historians still argue how much sway she actually had over state affairs. Some say she was merely a decorative confidante. Others insist she maneuvered behind the curtain like a seasoned strategist. You watch as she reads one of those pamphlets aloud at her salon, then laughs. Not a loud laugh, but the kind that says, "Try harder." Then she pours more tea. She plays host to artists, critics, and scientists. She decorates with Chinese silks and Greek urns. Her taste becomes France's taste. Even her hairstyle, Le Pompadour, outlives her by centuries. Elvis owes her, in a way. And yet, beneath all this glitter lies rot. Her health falters. She battles tuberculosis. The king grows more superstitious. He listens less, gambles more, leans harder on the indulgent comforts of hunting, and mistresses more pliable than Pompadour. Eventually, her decline is quiet but clear. She dies in 1764 at the age of 42. Louis weeps. Not theatrically, not for show, just the honest sorrow of a man who realizes too late that he'll never have such an equal again. And when her body leaves Versailles in the rain, the king watches from the window, whispering, the marquise will not have good weather for her journey. It's a rare moment of humanity. You look around this palace and realize, mistresses weren't accessories. They weren't just bed warmers or ornaments. They were nodes in the neural network of French monarchy, channels through which decisions flowed, alliances formed, and empires twisted. They were gatekeepers, puppeteers, and occasionally, puppets themselves. And whether in silk or sickness, adored or defamed, every one of them understood the most essential truth of Versailles. Power isn't about who sits on the throne. It's about who whispers in the dark behind it. The marble corridors feel colder now, not because winter has arrived, but because Marie Antoinette has. And with her comes the quiet, churning discontent of a world teetering on the edge of collapse, even as the court still twirls in satin. She's only 14 when she arrives in France, a Habsburg archduchess with a spine of spun sugar and expectations heavier than Versailles itself. You follow her down the Galerie de Glaces on her wedding day, her heels clicking against a path lined with foreign eyes and clutched fans. She marries the Dauphin, soon to be Louis XVI, a boy as awkward as she is luminous. And quickly, the court begins to murmur. She's too frivolous, too fashionable, too foreign. She laughs too loud. She spends too much. And, worst of all, she has no air for years. Whispers cling to her hem like burrs. When she smiles at the wrong nobleman, the gossips sharpen their quills. When she dances in too short a gown, pamphlets sprout in Paris overnight, painting her as a seductress, a libertine, a mistress in all but title. One even depicts her, well, let's just say she's in compromising positions with 3 courtiers and a violin. And here's the twist, you can't quite tell what's real. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette had actual affairs. There's the Swedish count, Axel von Fersen, a favorite in her company, known for his strong jaw and his tendency to accidentally be wherever she was. Love letters exist. Redacted, scorched, repaired by ultraviolet ink. Some contain phrases that raise eyebrows. Others are maddeningly vague. Was it platonic? Romantic? Political? You sit in her private hamlet at Petit Trianon, a mock village she built, complete with faux shepherds' huts and porcelain milk pitchers. Critics saw this as escapist fantasy, tone-deaf indulgence. But you walk the winding paths and wonder, what if it was survival? A place to pretend, for just a moment, that she wasn't being dissected every day? Marie wasn't a mistress in the traditional sense. She was the queen. But Versailles had rewritten the rulebook. Power wasn't just in titles anymore. It was in narratives. And hers was spiraling out of her control. She becomes a character in a story others write for her. Madame Deficit. The Austrian whore. Queen of scandals. Never mind that she actually reduced her household expenses. Never mind that many of the diamond bills weren't hers. Once the people believed the fiction, it became truth. Here's a quirky detail, the infamous affair of the diamond necklace. She had nothing to do with it. Not a coin. Not a word. But her silence, her aloofness, her image of detached privilege, those were enough to convict her in the court of public opinion. And Versailles? Versailles offered no refuge. As the revolution brews, Marie walks halls where her portraits once hung and now see only blank hooks. Nobles defect. Servants flee. She still hosts dinners, but the laughter sounds brittle, as if everyone's checking their necks for phantom nooses. By the time they drag her to the guillotine, the pamphlets no longer mock her, they crave her blood. She's 37. Dressed in white. Her hair cut short to expose her neck more cleanly. She doesn't scream. Doesn't cry. She steps up with the same grace that once made courtiers bow. But in the seconds before the blade falls, one wonders, did she ever understand the world that condemned her? Or did Versailles raise her too high, too blind? You leave her room at Petit Trianon, the sun slanting just right through the glass. Dust motes float like ghosts. And the question lingers, was Marie Antoinette a scandal? Or a scapegoat? In this palace, it's often hard to tell the difference. You wander back inside, where the sunlight dims behind damask drapes and the air grows still, almost conspiratorial. Versailles is no longer just a palace, it's a labyrinth. Every doorway could open into a powder room or a secret passage. And if you listen closely enough, past the rustle of silk and the clink of porcelain, you'll hear them again, secrets. Real ones. Not gossip or fiction. The kind whispered behind boudoir wallpaper. Here, nothing is what it seems. You press your palm against a panel near the queen's bedchamber. It gives way, just a hair. A seam. A hinge. In Versailles, many walls were more than walls, they were portals. Hidden compartments, revolving mirrors, peepholes, servant corridors so narrow and quiet they felt like veins running through a sleeping body. And no one used them better than the women who lived within them. Behind one such panel was a staircase Marie Antoinette used to flee the mob in October 1789. She ran barefoot, clutching her son's hand, while torchlight flickered through the outer halls. It's still there, that narrow passage. Still smells faintly of iron and mildew. Still tells the truth about how quickly a queen can become prey. But the boudoirs weren't always places of escape. Sometimes, they were stages. You enter one now, gilt-trimmed, impossibly intimate, no wider than a ballroom skirt. It's decorated in pastels and padded whispers. On the far wall, a mirror, framed in gold leaf but angled downward, perfect for watching without appearing to look. This room belonged to one of Louis XV's lesser-known mistresses. She wasn't titled. Her name rarely made the pamphlets. But she had this space, her cocoon of influence. Ministers came here for tea, emerging with new titles, land grants, or suspiciously rapid promotions. Here's a fringe fact, at least 2 royal mistresses are known to have hosted private confessionals in their boudoirs, not for spiritual cleansing, but for collecting secrets. Confessors were often bribed. Penitents, flattered. Everything was recorded. Everything had a price. And it wasn't just the women who mastered this art. Men, especially the ambitious ones, used their wives or sisters to gain proximity. A well-placed smile at a mistress's tea table could open doors that diplomacy never would. It was soft power, yes. But in a place like Versailles, soft power was often deadlier than cannon fire. Historians still debate how many affairs of state began not in council rooms but on chaise lounges. Was the 7 Years' War lengthened because Madame de Pompadour found one ambassador unimaginative? Did a grain tax hold longer than it should have because a duchess was gifted a diamond tiara? No one can say for certain. And yet, no one can rule it out. You run your hand along the carved edge of the wallpaper. Intricate vines, each leaf curling in a different direction. But one feels off, slightly raised. You press. A drawer pops open. Inside, an ivory fan, stiff with age. And beneath it, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and sealed with wax. No crest. Just a single word etched in careful script, Rappel. Remember. You don't open it. Not because you're afraid of what's inside, but because it's more powerful that way. An unopened secret is the currency of Versailles. And yet, despite all this elegance and trickery, despite the silk-lined betrayals and perfumed propaganda, there's an emptiness here. These walls are too perfect. These secrets too curated. It's like Versailles knew it would one day become a museum, and started rehearsing early. You leave the boudoir, the drawer clicked shut again behind you. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughs too loudly. Someone clinks their glass and pretends they're not watching the door. And as you walk away, you realize, in Versailles, the most honest things are hidden in the quietest corners. You stand at the edge of a salon, and for a moment, it feels like nothing is happening. Just nobles chatting in soft tones, flicking fans and raising eyebrows. But look closer. That lady over there just tapped her fan against her cheek, once, twice, and paused. That gesture? A dismissal. Not of the person she's speaking to, but of someone across the room, who instantly blushes and turns away. Welcome to the language of flirtation, Versailles style, where every eye flick, every fan flutter, every gesture of the wrist is more loaded than a gun at dawn. In a world where words can be overheard and letters intercepted, silent communication becomes survival. The court develops a whole lexicon of movement, a ballet of coded signals. Raise your fan to your lips. I desire you. Drop it suddenly. We're discovered. Run. You try it yourself. A slow flick open. A brief concealment of the eyes. Someone across the room nods. You're part of the conversation now, even if you never speak. This isn't accidental. Versailles trains its women, and its men, in this choreography. Daughters of the nobility were taught fan language as part of their finishing education, right alongside embroidery and the correct way to faint. Here's a delightful tidbit. Some fans had cheat sheets painted faintly onto their spines, little pictograms only visible at the right angle. A secret phrase etched into the ivory might read Je brûle d'amour, I burn with love. Subtle? Maybe not. But in Versailles, subtlety is about how you display desire, not whether you feel it. But flirtation isn't just a game. It's a weapon. A political tool. A path. That lady in green? She's not batting her lashes because she's idle. She's trying to gain entry into Madame de Pompadour's next salon. And the gentleman responding with a hand to his waistcoat? He's indicating he might be able to help, with the right encouragement. Historians still debate how many court appointments were arranged via fan language alone. There are letters between nobles hinting at a certain fold of the wrist that secured a naval command, or an extended flutter that led to an annulled debt. You pass a full-length mirror and notice how people use reflection, too. Catching glances without turning. Smiling into the glass just long enough to let someone know they've been seen and admired. Versailles has mirrors everywhere, not just for grandeur, but for surveillance. Social and sensual. One peculiar fashion born from this dance? The eye patch, but not for injury. Nobles would wear velvet patches under one eye, not to protect, but to highlight flirtation. A patch signaled mystery. Suffering. The sort of noble pain that made poets swoon and ministers listen a little more carefully. Even accessories got in on the code. Gloves removed slowly implied intrigue. Gloves thrown on a chair? Frustration. A ring turned inward meant unavailability. A ribbon dropped from a corset and not retrieved? Invitation. This choreography extends to letters, too. Sealed in specific wax colors, scented with specific herbs. A letter pressed with lavender was wistful. Rosewater meant passion. Juniper? Secret meanings. And if a note was handed over by a footman without eye contact, it might just contain something dangerous. But it's not all frivolity. This web of flirtation binds alliances. It ruins reputations. That's the terrifying truth. One misread fanflutter could spell exile. One smile held too long could start a duel or a revolution. Versailles was a place where touching hands in public was more intimate than a kiss behind a curtain. Where knowing how to raise an eyebrow could do more for your future than 10 years of family loyalty. As you leave the salon, a woman in purple glances your way and delicately drops her fan. She doesn't pick it up. You don't move. The air holds its breath. But nothing happens. Because sometimes, in Versailles, not reacting is the loudest move of all. You trail behind a young courier now, barely 16, his shoes scuffed and his gaze darting between hallways like a pigeon sensing storm. He carries a letter sealed in dark green wax, tucked beneath his waistcoat, close to his heart. Not for sentiment, for protection. Because here at Versailles, a piece of parchment can be more dangerous than a pistol. Tonight, you follow the tangled web of letters that never reached their destination. Somewhere in the palace, behind a velvet screen and 2 guards pretending not to eavesdrop, a duchess awaits word from her lover. He's in Burgundy, or perhaps he only said he was. The courier is stopped at the 3rd corridor, questioned, redirected. When he arrives, finally, the letter's been opened already, resealed perfectly, mind you, but the scent is off. No longer lavender. Now it smells like anxiety. This is not rare. In fact, Versailles practically runs on intercepted letters. The postmaster is loyal to the king, and the king, well, he wants to know who is whispering to whom, and why. Private correspondence is rarely private. Love notes are copied, debated, and occasionally passed to rivals for amusement. One French tale, whispered by servants and dismissed by scholars, tells of a chambermaid who memorized a minister's entire letter from one glance and dictated it flawlessly to her mistress while powdering a wig. The mistress, in turn, used the information to blackmail the minister into marrying her cousin. True? Who knows? But you believe it. Codes became necessary, of course. Invisible ink made from lemon juice. Special folds that tore if tampered with. Phrases like "the roses are in bloom" meaning "meet me behind the chapel at midnight." A shoe drawn in the corner. The matter is urgent. A cloud? We are being watched. You open a drawer in one of the lesser-used salons and find a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. The first is written in mirrored script, reversed, so only legible when held to a glass. The second bears no writing at all, just a pressed flower and a smear of lipstick. The third is written in such deliberately ugly penmanship that even the royal codebreakers, it's said, took 2 weeks to decipher it. And yet even the most artful letter couldn't always outrun betrayal. Madame de Pompadour, one of Louis XV's earliest mistresses, once wrote a letter begging for a second chance after being dismissed. It never reached him. Why? Because Madame de Chateauroux, her replacement, burned it herself, right in front of a stunned servant, then made the servant recite what little he remembered, just for amusement. Historians still argue whether some of France's worst military missteps in the 18th century were due not to bad generals, but lost letters, intercepted orders, delayed missives, or notes never sent for fear they'd fall into the wrong hands. Some say the disastrous loss at Minorca wasn't entirely due to incompetence, but a mistress interfering with the chain of command despite a former suitor. Even Marie Antoinette's fate was sealed partly in ink. Her letters to Count Axel von Fersen, those delicate, intimate, redacted pieces of longing, were copied and recopied by revolutionary authorities. We still don't know what was cut out. Were they love letters? Political pleas? Desperate cries for help? Maybe all three. You tuck the bundle back into its drawer and close it slowly. These aren't just letters. They're ghosts. Verses never spoken aloud. Lives steered off course by miscommunication or too much honesty. And just as you stand, another courier brushes past you, muttering apologies. He's carrying a plain envelope with no seal. Suspicious in its blandness. He turns the corner. You never see him again. You slip into a quiet chapel tucked in the east wing of Versailles, where gold leaf halos look down from painted ceilings and the scent of old incense clings to the stones like memory. The organ is silent. The pews are polished. And kneeling at the far end, draped in prayer shawls and pearls, are two figures, one, a priest with soft hands, the other, unmistakably, a royal mistress. You weren't expecting to find them here. But you should have. Because even in a court dripping with sin and silk, the church was never far behind. It simply looked the other way, selectively. The mistresses of Versailles may have broken commandments regularly, but they did so under the watchful eye of God's representatives, many of whom were quite comfortable collecting favors along with confessions. A woman like Madame de Montespan had her own chaplain. So did Madame de Maintenon. They offered blessings, took confession, and sometimes delivered private masses just after the candles in the bedroom were snuffed out. You move closer and see how the lines blur: religion and politics, piety and indulgence. The bishop who grants absolution in the morning might dine with his penitent's lover that same evening, sipping Burgundy and nodding along to gossip cloaked in moral concern. One particularly curious story concerns Madame du Barry. After being installed as the official mistress, she was required to marry to maintain some shred of decorum. So she did, on paper. And then she was ceremonially introduced at court, blessed by a bishop who had previously railed against adultery from the pulpit. Historians still debate whether the bishop was bribed or simply encouraged to reconsider the nature of divine forgiveness. You spot a golden crucifix tucked discreetly into a powder box. It belonged to Louise de la Valliere. She kept it even while living openly as the king's mistress, hiding it between silks and jewels like a talisman against judgment. Later, when she finally retreated into a convent, that same crucifix was placed on the altar for her final vows. Versailles was rife with contradictions like this. Mistresses hosted charity events for orphanages one day and conspired to ruin rival families the next. They commissioned chapel restorations while orchestrating affairs beneath stained glass windows. They took communion in the morning and blackmail in the afternoon. Here's your French tidbit. In 1705, a private mass was held at Versailles in a salon newly decorated by a mistress, where the wine for the Eucharist was served from the same decanter used for champagne the night before. The priest was reportedly so drunk on influence, if not the wine, that he forgot the final blessing. Not every priest was complicit, of course. Some genuinely tried to guide their high society penitents toward repentance. One confessor warned Madame de Pompadour that her influence would bring judgment upon the nation. She responded by donating a chapel wing in his name, and continued attending court as if nothing had happened. And then there were the Jesuits. Ever the schemers and saviors. They advised royals, confessed queens, educated princes, and occasionally acted as messengers between lovers, cloaking sin in scripture. One Jesuit priest famously said, "To keep the king close to God, one must keep him close to his conscience." He conveniently omitted how often that conscience was entangled with a woman in silk. You step back into the marble corridor, past a small door carved with lilies, the emblem of the French crown and the Virgin Mary. The irony is not lost on you. Versailles wore its religion like jewelry, ornamental, extravagant, occasionally genuine, but mostly for show. The court might bow before the altar, but their true devotions were whispered elsewhere, behind fans, within curtained alcoves, and on lips still stained with last night's wine. The church didn't cleanse Versailles. It just kept it from falling apart. At least, for a little while longer. You descend into one of the lesser courtyards, where the gravel crunches softer and the walls don't shine. The usual parade of powdered wigs and hooped skirts is absent here. In their place, whispers, cloaks, and the occasional flash of breeches that don't quite match the uniform. This is where you begin to see the court's most unexpected players, women who didn't play by the rules because they rewrote them. Mistresses in men's clothing. The phrase may sound dramatic, even scandalous. But at Versailles, crossing lines wasn't always punished, sometimes it was rewarded, especially when done with style, subtlety, or a well-timed smirk. You meet one such legend, the Chevalier d'Eon. Born Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste André Timothy d'Eon de Beaumont. Yes, all of that, this courtier served as a diplomat, a soldier, and a spy. For the first half of their career, d'Eon lived and presented as a man. Then, quite suddenly, they declared they had been assigned the wrong gender at birth and would live henceforth as a woman. And here's the astonishing part, Versailles said yes. Not only was d'Eon allowed to change wardrobe and title, they received a pension to help purchase appropriate attire. Historians still debate d'Eon's identity. Were they transgender, non-binary, playing a long political game, or simply refusing to be labeled at all? No answer satisfies everyone. But the fact remains, Versailles accepted them, gossiped endlessly about them, and even painted their portrait in full lace and wig. They weren't the only one blurring the lines. You peek into a masquerade ball, and there's a duchess in officer's uniform, sword swinging gently at her hip, dancing with a marquis in a floral gown. These events were sanctioned escapism. For one night, Titles and roles were unpinned like brooches. Women dressed as men, men as women, and everyone understood. The costume might be silk, but the statement beneath it was steel. Here's your quirky detail. One mistress, known only in memoirs as La Mouche, the fly, regularly wore men's boots and carried a pistol, not out of necessity, but to unsettle her rivals. She claimed it made her more trustworthy to the king. He knows I will never faint when business gets rough. Not all women cross-dressed for fashion or shock. Some did it to survive. Lower-born courtesans sometimes disguised themselves as footboys to gain entry into Versailles, slipping through the servant corridors until they found a wealthy protector, or a way to blackmail one. A handful succeeded, trading breeches for bodices once inside, revealing their true identity only after gaining favor. And of course, there were those who never switched back. You step into a long-forgotten salon-turned-library, where a portrait hangs of a woman in full hunting garb, trousers, boots, rifle. Her name? The Marquise de Brinvilliers. Poisoner, seductress, and alleged crossdresser. She hosted political discussions in her salon dressed like a musketeer, and once reportedly shot an apple off a courtier's head just to make a point. The point being, don't underestimate me. Historians still argue how many of these gender-bending figures were genuine expressions versus carefully crafted personas. Was Dion sincere or strategic? Was La Mouche bold or merely bored? But perhaps the better question is, why did Versailles allow them? And the answer, as always, is power. If you were entertaining enough, clever, charming, dangerous in the right ways, Versailles forgave almost anything. Because identity here was a tool. A costume. A set of notes played for an audience of rivals and lovers. You walk past a mirror, catch your own reflection again, and for a brief moment, you see both your past and your pretense. Versailles wasn't a place of authenticity. It was a stage. And sometimes, the best way to survive the script was to play the opposite role entirely. Gender, class, loyalty, these weren't walls. They were curtains, meant to be pulled back when the time was right. And when they parted, oh, what performance! The scent hits you before anything else, clove, rose, musk, something floral but undercut with the faint bitterness of herbs. You're not in a garden. You're in a dressing room. A royal one. The walls are lined with little bottles, crystal, porcelain, pewter stoppered. And this, dear listener, is not vanity. This is strategy. Welcome to the hidden world of Versailles perfumes, where every scent told a story, masked a secret, and carried more weight than most treaties. You uncork a vial labeled Amber Imperial. It smells rich, commanding. You imagine it dabbed behind the ears of Madame de Montespan before confronting her rivals. Another bottle labeled Eau de Violette is lighter, powdered, demure. It may have belonged to Louise de la Valliere, the scent of quiet suffering. But perfumes here weren't just about mood or fashion, they were weapons. Versailles, for all its glamour, stank. Literally. The palace had few functioning toilets, even fewer baths, and several hundred bodies packed together in corsets and brocade. Scent wasn't optional. It was armor. Here's a lesser-known fact. Many courtiers dabbed scent not just on their wrists or necks, but on their wigs, gloves, letters, even furniture. An entire lexicon of meaning developed: jasmine for seduction, myrrh for mourning, mint for purity, and civet for confidence, even though civet smelled like a barn on a humid day. And some smells were dangerous. Arsenic was used in small amounts as a cosmetic lightener and, yes, in some fragrances, believed to preserve the freshness of flowers or give a metallic sharpness. One mistress, according to court lore, wore a rosewater blend that made the king sneeze every time she approached. Rather than change it, she increased the dosage. "If he won't cry for me," she once quipped, "he'll sneeze." You glance at a carved ebony box tucked into the back of a dresser. Inside, musk pods, dried orange peels, powdered iris root, and, most notably, a sachet labeled in careful script, Soleil Noir, Black Sun. This was a rumored blend associated with Madame du Barry, supposedly so potent that servants fainted after opening her windows in the morning. Historians still argue whether such scents had hypnotic qualities or were simply overwhelming. One scholar insists certain formulas were precursors to chemical sedatives. Another argues that the psychological impact, paired with low lighting and social pressure, was more effective than any potion. There's also the matter of glove poisoning. It was whispered, never proven, that some mistresses perfumed their gloves with deadly concoctions. The idea? A caress, a hand to the face, and within days, fever, confusion, collapse. No blade, no scream, just scent and silence. And always, conveniently, an alibi. After all, what could be more innocent than perfume? You inhale from a folded fan, delicately perfumed with eau de hermitage. It was said to calm the nerves. And yet, as you lower it, your fingers tingle just slightly. Real or imagined? That's the Versailles question. Nothing here is what it claims to be, not even the lavender. The king himself had signature blends. Louis XIV favored orange blossom with a touch of neroli and musk. His mistresses mimicked or counterbalanced this scent, depending on how close they wanted to feel, or how far they hoped to pull him. Scent, in this context, was language. And when scent wasn't enough, there was smoke. Burning herbs, incense, and spiritual perfumes were used to cleanse rooms, or curse them. Madame de Maintenon reportedly kept a vial of blessed lavender to sprinkle in her salon whenever she suspected Athenais had passed through. An apothecary once noted in his journal, "The smell of sin lingers longer than most incense." You step out of the dressing room and feel the night air hit you. It smells of damp stone and old roses. Natural, finally. Honest. But even here, outside the perfume-drenched walls, you realize the mistresses of Versailles didn't just wear scent. They used it as a veil, as a seduction, as a battlefield strategy. And like everything at court, it was never just for show. You find yourself in a long, silent corridor where candlelight flickers against rows of painted faces. Portrait after portrait, frame after gilded frame, stares back at you, expressionless yet impossibly loud. These are not just art pieces. They are weapons, deceptions, confessions. At Versailles, a portrait was a manifesto you wore on the wall. You stop before one of Madame de Pompadour. She's radiant, of course, rosy cheeks, a gentle smile, book in hand to prove her intellect. But look closely. Her waist is impossibly narrow. Her skin too flawless. A beauty mark shifted just slightly to the left, meant to hint at coquetry. The painter knew his audience. The portrait isn't a reflection, it's a revision. And this was Versailles' specialty, rewriting truth with brushstrokes. Artists were more than craftsmen, they were courtly surgeons. Their job? Erase blemishes, slim faces, lighten complexions. Add a little sparkle to the eyes, remove 5 years from the chin. In an age before Photoshop, you manipulated your legacy with oil paint. But not all eyes were cosmetic. You approach a lesser-known painting of a duchess seated demurely with one hand on her lap, the other holding an apple. The apple, it turns out, is symbolic. It refers to a very specific affair. That affair, in turn, led to a brief change in foreign alliances. Yes, really. One bite, one gesture, one brushstroke, whole policies pivoted on such things. Here's a quirky footnote. Louis XV once rejected a commissioned portrait of one of his own mistresses because the painter had captured her too accurately. In other words, too honestly. The replacement version, softer, prettier, less human, was hung immediately. And then there were the secret signals. Fans of iconography knew how to read the background props: a clock for lost time, a dog for fidelity, often ironic, a candle for fleeting love. Sometimes, even the wallpaper behind the subject gave away the painter's real opinion. In one case, a mistress is painted before a wilting bouquet, subtle, yes, but the court noticed. Historians still debate the true identity of a certain portrait labeled only La Belle Inconnue. Some claim she was a low-born seamstress favored briefly by Louis XIV, then vanished. Others believe she was a decoy, a body double used to distract attention from a real mistress whose face appears nowhere. Either way, the painting remains, her smile carved into eternity like a riddle. But not all portraits lied. Some told more than they meant to. You pause before a painting of Madame du Barry. She's in white satin, powdered curls tumbling over one shoulder. At first glance, it's textbook flattery. But then you notice the slight tension in her neck. The way her hand grips the folds of her dress a little too tightly. The redness around the eyes, almost hidden under pale blue paint. The artist knew. He saw the decay beneath the diamonds. There's another portrait, almost hidden in a dark alcove, of a young child. Unnamed. Wearing a noble's miniature sash. The child is rumored to be the illegitimate offspring of a powerful mistress. No official record exists. But the painting remains, like a whisper too stubborn to die. Here's a fringe detail. One painter, Nicolas de Largellière, was known for correcting pregnancies in his portraits, either by disguising them with strategically placed fabric or by emphasizing the stomach just enough to imply royal favor. It depended on who was paying. And you, walking this hall, realized these paintings were not just about how you looked, but about what version of you the court wanted to remember. A pregnant mistress could become a symbol of fertility or a scandal, depending on how her portrait framed her. A queen could be painted looking away from the viewer, meant to suggest piety, but in reality, signaling political detachment. A slightly turned ring on a subject's finger might imply infidelity. A missing brooch? Loss of favor. You come to the last portrait. It's cracked slightly, the lacquer flaking at the edges. The woman's face is half-lit, eyes unreadable, a single curl falling out of place. There's no nameplate. No crest. Just a presence. And you wonder, not for the first time, if it's not just the past watching you, but the painted memories of those who refuse to disappear. The silence of the portrait gallery gives way to a new sound, distant shouting. Not the shrill gossip of courtiers this time, but the coarse cries of crowds. The glass is cracking. The chandeliers are rattling. Versailles, once a stage for satin and innuendo, is about to become a ruin. The revolution is here. You walk through the outer halls of the palace, where the gold still gleams, but the air has changed. Once filled with perfume and flattery, it now reeks of sweat and fear. The mistresses are no longer adored. They are symbols of luxury, of greed, of everything wrong with the world outside these walls. For years, their charms, schemes, and whisper campaigns kept them alive. Now, none of that matters. The revolution does not care about perfume, or portraiture, or whether your smile once changed the course of a treaty. It wants blood, and it knows their names. Madame du Barry is one of the first to fall. She had tried to retreat into quiet luxury at Louveciennes, surrounding herself with roses and fine porcelain, but the mobs didn't forget her. Her past clung to her like silk in a rainstorm. She's arrested, imprisoned, and dragged to the guillotine in 1793. Her last words, a scream, a plea for one more moment, are swallowed by the roar of a crowd that once would have lined up just to see her jewels. Others attempt escape. Some go east, to Austria or Prussia. Others shave their heads, take up false names, melt into the rising republic like sugar into black coffee, bitter, irreversible. A few, astonishingly, survive by reinventing themselves. One former mistress becomes a schoolteacher. Another joins a convent she once scandalized. But even the mistresses who never held official title feel the wave. You hear tales of salon hostesses denounced by their own protégés. A woman once praised for her wit is now condemned for having noble airs. The very fans that fluttered messages of love are now burned in public squares as symbols of decadence. That secret corridor you walked through? It's bricked up, sealed, as if history itself is trying to forget. And yet, not all the revolutionaries are blind to irony. Here's your fringe detail. During a trial in 1792, a Jacobin lawyer quoted Madame de Pompadour's famous phrase, après nous, le déluge, as a prophecy fulfilled. He accused her of planting the seeds of ruin beneath France's roses. But in a private letter, found years later, the same lawyer admitted to having a miniature of her in his desk. He called her the cleverest woman France ever ignored. Historians still debate the extent to which the mistresses contributed to the revolution. Were they parasites on the crown? Or scapegoats for a collapsing system no one dared confront? Some argue their influence hollowed out the monarchy. Others say they merely reflected its contradictions, luxury beside rot, desire beside duty. You pass through a door half off its hinges. Behind it, a room once used for private readings. Now, ash. Torn drapery. A single slipper, embroidered with pearls, rests untouched in the soot. It's hard to say whether it belonged to a queen or a courtesan. Here, they were often indistinguishable. You linger at a cracked mirror. Your reflection, once crisp and symmetrical, now fragments. One half regal, the other, terrified. The same divide that now cleaves France. And just before you turn away, you see something scrawled in the corner of the glass. A finger dragged through dust. They listened to us when we whispered. Now they shout without knowing why. Outside, the storm grows louder. Inside, Versailles holds its breath. The drums have quieted now. The guillotines stand idle, like monstrous toys left out in the rain. Revolution has scorched through France, burning titles and tapestries alike, but still, some mistresses remain. Not in palaces, not in silks, but in new shapes, new roles, cloaked in reinvention. You walk the streets of post-revolution Paris, where the perfume has been replaced by coal smoke and the salons by reading rooms. And in a narrow apartment above a shuttered hat shop, a woman once called La Belle Rouse, a former mistress of a prince, is now Madame Renard, quiet schoolteacher. Her hands that once wore emeralds now grade dictation in pencil. Her lover died on the scaffold. She teaches children who have never seen a king. She is not alone. Many women who once held whispers in their palms have adapted, transforming from ornaments of the ancien regime into survivors of the new age. Some start salons again, not for flirtation, but for politics, literature, enlightenment. Their guests are no longer dukes and abbés, but radicals, skeptics, inventors. You step into one such salon, a modest room scented with ink and wine. At its center sits a woman in her 50s, once known to Versailles as Mademoiselle F. Her real name has been restored, and her reputation? That's been carefully, quietly recrafted. She now writes treatises on women's education. No mention of the nights she spent in brocade sheets with men who signed edicts by candlelight. Here's your curious historical morsel. One former mistress, after surviving both exile and imprisonment, reinvented herself as a spiritualist. She claimed to communicate with the spirits of former monarchs, including her lover. Her seances became so popular that even Napoleon's generals attended, hoping to get advice from Louis XVI's ghost. Historians still argue whether these reinventions were genuine transformations or just camouflage, strategies for survival in a country that had gone from powdered wigs to powdered cannons in less than a decade. And yet, not every story ends in obscurity. One former mistress, Madame Tauline, known during the Revolution as Our Lady of Thermidor, actually helped lead the downfall of Robespierre. Yes, that Robespierre. She used her wit, her network, and more than a little seduction to shift the tides of blood. After the Revolution, she married into nobility again, different titles, same game. She would later inspire the short-lived neoclassical fashion trend of draped gowns with bare feet, a look supposedly modeled on her prison attire. History has jokes. Then there were the writers. One former lover of a high-ranking duke published a thinly veiled memoir, claiming to be only an observer, but describing court intrigues in such intimate detail that nobles could barely read it without blanching. It sold out its first printing. She used the profits to found a printing press. Others became memoirists, hostesses, philosophical muses. The skills they once used to navigate bedchambers now helped them navigate the Republic. Conversation, charm, manipulation, reinvention. These were still currency. The game had changed, but the rules? Surprisingly familiar. And then there are those who vanished. Their names scrubbed from letters. Their portraits hidden in attics. Their children raised by relatives. No tombstones. No scandal. Just a soft disappearance, like a perfume note fading from memory. You pause before a cracked mirror in an old boutique. It once belonged to Madame de Montespan. The shopkeeper doesn't know that. But when you peer into the glass, you feel it. That trace of something elegant, sharp, impossible. The look of a woman who once held the King of France in the palm of her hand, and then, when the hand closed, let him go. You realize then, Versailles mistresses weren't only creatures of luxury. They were students of change. Adaptable. Dangerous. Brilliant. And like all great performers, they knew how to bow before the curtain fell, and when to slip backstage and start over. You fast forward now, not through time, but through essence. Versailles is behind you, but its shadows still cling. You're standing in a sleek hotel suite in Paris, television humming softly, a perfume bottle gleaming on a vanity, and a smartphone buzzing with notifications. And you realize, the game hasn't ended. It's just wearing new clothes. Welcome to the modern echo of courtly scandal. The rules have changed. The costumes are different. But the power plays? The seduction? The whispers that shape history behind closed doors? They're still here. You scroll through a tabloid headline, First Lady or First Mistake? You recognize the cadence. It's the 21st century equivalent of Versailles pamphleteering. Only now, it happens in 12-point font with high-res images and anonymous sources close to the palace. Mistresses no longer enter through side doors. They arrive in limousines and red carpets. Their stage isn't the Hall of Mirrors, it's Instagram. Their fans? Literal followers. Take Élysée Palace, for instance. Not technically Versailles, but close enough in spirit. A French president's affair with an actress? We've seen that. A journalist mistress turned partner turned political icon? That too. The public appetite for scandal remains as insatiable as ever. The only difference? Now we don't have to wait for gossip to travel through servants. We get it in real time. You look at a designer bag slung over the arm of a celebrity turned political influencer. People mock her online for being frivolous. They analyze her posture, her shoes, her relationships. Sound familiar? It's Marie Antoinette's story all over again, only this time with better lighting and fewer corsets. Here's a modern French fact. A best-selling French perfume, Juliet Has a Gun, was inspired by court intrigue and modern seduction. Its tagline? Not a perfume, an attitude. It's Madame de Pompadour with a credit card. And the coded language? Oh, it's still alive. Emojis, cryptic captions, unsubtle tweets that say I'm fine when they mean wait until I release the podcast. Fan language has become digital. The battlefield is still love and influence, only now, it's algorithms and sponsored posts instead of silk gloves and salon invitations. Historians of today aren't only digging through letters in faded ink, they're scrolling through archived DMs. A former mistress of a prime minister might now release a memoir, or a YouTube series, or sue for breach of privacy. The theater remains, only the curtains are touch screens. And then there's the rebranding. Mistresses aren't called mistresses anymore. They're partners, consultants, creative collaborators, muses. Their titles have softened, but their impact hasn't. Behind every powerful man, and increasingly, woman, you'll often find someone who isn't married to them but shapes their image, their message, their downfall. Versailles taught us how to look for them. The modern world just gave them better PR. You sip your coffee, still warm in your hand, and wonder if Louise de la Valliere had TikTok, would she have gone viral for her tragic sincerity? If Madame du Barry had a podcast, what secrets might she have spilled? If Pompadour had a lifestyle brand, would we all be buying scented wig spray and Enlightenment-themed throw pillows? And that's the thing, isn't it? Versailles never truly ended. It just moved online. The balconies are digital. The courtiers have stylists. The revolutionaries have follower counts. And the whispers, those irresistible, devastating little whispers, are still what we crave. Because we aren't just watching the powerful. We're still flirting with them. Still learning from their mistresses. Still asking the same questions. Who loves whom? Who controls what? And how much of it is real? And in the end, you know, deep down, that the line between past and present is as thin as a silk ribbon. Tied in a bow, then slowly, carefully, pulled loose. The palace is quiet again. Not in the way it was centuries ago, when silence meant secrecy, and every hush was a prelude to a scandal, but the deeper kind of quiet that comes after too many voices have faded. You're back in Versailles now, walking its empty halls just before closing time. The tourists have gone. The guards murmur softly. The air carries only the faint scent of beeswax and old dust. This is where the last secrets live. You slip into a side gallery, long and dim, where the light doesn't quite reach the corners. Here, the most final confessions wait, not etched in stone, but hidden in margins, tucked in footnotes, passed down in eyebrow raises and footnotes too delicate for the main text. There's a drawer in a gilded desk, unopened for decades. You slide it open slowly. Inside, a velvet pouch. And within it, a lock of hair. Blonde. Tied with red thread. No name. No label. But someone kept it. Touched it. Carried it across storms and decades. Love? Blackmail? Mourning? Versailles never explains. You step through the bedroom of a long-forgotten countess, her portrait missing, her lineage erased during the Revolution. But someone has scrawled something beneath the frame hook. Je n'étais que le secret de son rire. I was only the secret behind his laughter. It's not signed. It doesn't need to be. Because that's what most of these women were. Not wives. Not queens. But the invisible hinges upon which power turned. Even their children were often erased. One boy, raised in the countryside with a false surname, carried a locket all his life. It contained a miniature of a woman in a powdered wig, smiling, but not toward the artist. Smiling at something behind him. The artist never knew. But the boy did. Historians still argue how many illegitimate children of kings and mistresses made it into noble houses, unacknowledged. Some believe entire lines of European aristocracy trace back to affairs that never made the formal record. A duchess here, a bishop there. Carefully arranged marriages to cover quiet beginnings. A lifetime of riches built on a whispered night behind velvet drapes. And then there are the final acts. Madame de Maintenon burned hundreds of letters after Louis XIV's death. We know this because one survived, found behind a mirror in a drawer that jammed. It simply said, "Burn the rest." The truth isn't theirs. One courtier's memoir recalls a masked woman appearing at his door in 1791, asking for safe passage across the border. She carried only a trunk. Inside it, 3 wigs, 2 dresses, a ledger with cryptic names, and a small bundle wrapped in linen. The courtier never opened it. He said her silence told him more than confession ever could. And you, walking through this final room of echoes, understand, Versailles doesn't bury its secrets. It preserves them. In scent, in paint, in the bend of a staircase or the curve of a signature. Mistresses were never footnotes. They were the margin, and sometimes, the spine. They broke rules, reshaped politics, birthed nations, destroyed them, rebuilt them again in powder and whisper. And when history got loud, they disappeared. But not entirely. Never entirely. You pass a final tapestry. The thread is fading, but the image is clear. A woman at the edge of a bed, holding a candle, looking at a door that's been left ajar. You step closer, and you realize, the door's been left open for you. And now, the curtains fall. Not the velvet ones in Versailles, trimmed in gold and scandal, but the soft curtains you've drawn around yourself tonight. The ones that keep the noise out and the warmth in. Take a slow breath. You've walked through centuries of whispers, perfumes, broken hearts, and iron-willed women who learned to wield desire like a dagger. Some rose, some fell, but all of them moved quietly through the corridors of power, lighting candles in rooms where history pretended not to look. You felt the weight of jewels that bought favor, and the sting of letters never delivered. You've traced the powder trails of women forgotten by textbooks but immortalized in gossip. And if you're honest, maybe, just maybe, you understand now how power rarely enters through the front door. It sneaks in, perfumed and smiling, through a side corridor, wearing a name no one dares write down. But that's the beauty of secrets, isn't it? They don't disappear. They linger. So as you settle into your pillow, and the hush of your own room deepens, remember, some stories never end. They just dim like candlelight, still flickering somewhere behind silk-draped memories. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be soft, your blankets warm, and your thoughts kissed gently by powdered ghosts. Sweet dreams.